we have a couple of times during the conversation, we have spoken about ESG. And, you know, ESG, besides COVID-19, I think ESG is the most commonly used word nowadays in terms of corporate governance. So I want to ask specifically about your perspectives on ESG. And in particular, you know, people, my impression is people speak about ESG as if the concept of environmental, social, and corporate governance is somehow a revolution or something new for board members to be concerned with as part of their responsibility. And so I'm interested to hear your perspective on whether this concept of ESG is in fact a revolution from the perspective of a board member, and therefore requires somehow a new profile or a new skill set of a board member, or whether ESG is essentially a variation of what effective board members have been doing their entire lives in terms of supervising a company.
Well, my first provocation is the following. I fear cliches. Cliches become a logic within themselves, and people do not see the consequences the cliches bring. A philosophical distinction is this ethics of the principles and the ethics of consequences. This is a debate that is very important in philosophical aspects. In terms of principles, I believe that there is a consensus that take care about the environment, the social aspects, or the cooperative world have principles that are very relevant for a company. However, what is more and more important in a company or entity that have the goal of producing goals is the ethics of consequences. If ESG does not correspond to an activity that produces good results or results themselves, is just a cliche. So this is the first theme that I would like to hear my colleagues speak about that. Another point, I agree with Jeff. We are not facing a revolution. We are facing a new issue generated based on previous knowledge that we already had. 30 years ago, we knew about that. However, the urgency of the point created a new need. 7 billion people in the world. We have to moderate our resources. And the companies reflect the complexity of the situation and act on an area that is very difficult to deal with. So ESG now is important due to the urgency of the situation in our world today. Luisa and Roberto, I believe, could tell us more concretely about the theme. I believe that all that is within a cliche. Let's see. My vision is the following. The pandemic, this concern, the global concern that occurred with the virus and the way in which the world stopped made people to pay further attention in the social. Governance became very important in the 80s already. So we're speaking now about more than 30 years on cooperative governance. Is too much time that we debate this issue. But when we speak about the environmental aspects, we already debated this issue of sustainability and accountability of the corporation. So what I see is that the consumers, the ways in which the consumers started to relate themselves with the companies changed. The consumer is very interested in knowing what are the inputs, what are the basis for a beverage, or what the product contains. They want to know exactly what they are consuming. We already debated the traceability issue here. Every time more, we see people that are vegetarian, vegan, are concerned with that. Makeup, for instance, the girl wants to know what this product contains. So the consumer are more concerned with everything. So besides all the problems that the pandemic situation brought to us, now the companies had to debate ESG constantly. Here in Brazil, in the last 9 months, for instance, there is no event in a webinar or something connected with the company governance that this theme does not appear. I'm going to tell you that I believe that we already debated all that, governance and the environment mainly, and the social aspect less in the past, in my opinion. But Roberto, I believe that it has more insights than I to speak about it. Very interesting. Yes, first point. Well, this is an old concern. We had a meeting when Eloisa was working with Pavan, the WWF told us, we, the dinosaurs of sustainability, we won. Our agenda won. I never forget that because at that time, people spoke about sustainability, but the companies did not help and the boards did not help. And today, it's a cliche, right? You're right. And this cliche is becoming very important and is speeding up. The absorption of this issue becoming more serious in terms of governance. I was in a meeting because we acted in getting international investors, and the companies that would like to invest would also speak about that at the time. It was not seen too seriously by the analysts for pension funds, investments, and things like that. And they said, well, this is nice, let's speak a little bit about that. But it was not really a serious issue, not as it is today. The Ethos Institute, in one of the last meetings, invited my Porter to talk about that. The next day, analysts started speaking about the subject. It was Michael Porter, and people were very pleased to see him. And so there are fashions, there are cliches, there are waves. So we are within a wave of a theme that is not that new. But finally, this old theme is taken seriously by the market. Capital markets are paying attention. The ones that provide financial assets also pay attention to that. And I see the board's very concerned about that. I have to prepare myself. I have to know more about that. I agree that a cliche is dangerous, that this cannot be translated in in terms of just a vanish. No, you have to translate that into actions that are concrete. ESG is just going to function if it is really part and incorporated in the daily life of the companies, totally different than it was up to 2 years ago. So the cliche, the wave, the fad, Michael Porter, this growth of the importance of the subject is relevant. I believe that it is really provoking a movement in terms of the constitution of repertoires for the boards. This is positive, but there are challenges. He never dealt with S quite well. The three letters were together due to, convenience purposes. He has very problematic issues. When you have environmental restriction that is too strong, it excludes people, has a major impact, and this was not solved as yet. So we have a problem here. It's a basic problem of knowledge, how to combine E with S. And G is just an observer of this continue of the adaptation with E with S, like a curious person that is just looking at what is occurring with the others. So the situation that we have today leads us to have G starting to be interested by ENS, but the repertoire is still too weak to deal with ENS, not only with governance, but also with many organizations this occurs. Because in order for us to measure consequences, we have to have metrics. And those metrics are not clear, are not well developed. The basic tools, maybe we can say they exist, but in terms of the consequences, there are more macroeconomics, as Petro said, in terms of business models, they're not defined. So the main area of those metrics is like to translate E and S as values of the companies. No, it's intangible yet. Being intangible, we're going to have a great difficulty in monitoring and supervising, doing the oversight and acting on that. So the great problems of ENS, when we go deep, we have to translate ENS into values, not monetizing it. There is a difference in monetizing. So I have a carbon credit in the market and I get something about that. It's different from a social or cultural value that is not going to be monetized. So today, the world has difficulty in terms of deciding what is monetization of values from elements that are much more ethical and moral that are connected to those letters that are not monetized, but they have an impact on the value. And this is the major difficulty in the world of corporations and for the boards as a whole. So we are here facing to something that seems to be very interesting. It's a provocation of the world, trying to make the two letters talk one with another and to translate all that in some values, shared value that Michael Porter mentioned and others mentioned, capitalism today, more sophisticated capitalism and so on and so forth. And those values will going to have an impact on the business area. The pandemic crisis was a extreme shock in the relationships of the actions, make clear the inequalities that we had. And the inequalities started to connect themselves with the environment issues. The virus came from where? Nobody knows, but the manipulation of the humanity, because the Amazon, nobody knows what we have within the Amazon could be harmful to us. So the relationship between the inclusion of the social aspects started to get together in terms of the way in which humanity deals with the environment. The pandemic brought that much more than that. The problems of the climatic changes are worse still because there are no vaccines for that. If we believe in science, and I hope that everybody that do not believe in science can stay alive due to science, the problems of the climatic changes are going to have a great impact on our business models. So the boards have to be quite prepared for debating the changes in the climate. How will the companies adapt to those climatic changes? How the impact is going to be felt in business? The consequences are being seen already. The climatic changes have to be within the equation.
I would like to make two comments, two timely comments in relation to what you said. One is personal, so I'm going to talk about first. I think in these all these ESG, this whole alphabet soup, a very important characteristic will have to be solved, which is the fact that the E and S, they create demands for companies, whether it's in terms of behavior or costs, or in terms of procedures and policies and so on. Now, G from governance is related to capital management, and the capitalism and capital management do not have democratic characteristics. The election of board members is the board members are elected by those who have the capital, and therefore the ESG issues are of interest that go beyond company frontiers. And boards have to learn how to deal with issues that very often go against the immediate interests of any given company. So I would say that the G will take on the role of an arbitrator in the relationship between the E and the S. So this exercise of arbitration in the sense of financial theories or governance theories itself. And there's someone that Stiglitz, for example, someone I like very much, and Paul Krugman, they have been addressing this issue, this relationship between development and the ownership of capital. Now, I'd like to register a personal experience that I had. In the mid-90s, I was invited to be the member of the board of a major fund that had operations in Brazil and elsewhere. And it was linked to a big financial institution. I was part of a board that the vetoing power in terms of the choice of assets that were part of this fund. And this veto had to be based on social, environmental, and corporate governance issues. At that time, myself and board members of the caliber of Roberto and Eloisa, which vetoed 5 companies that could not be part of the portfolio. And in terms of, they were quite representative in the Bovespa index, and the Bovespa index is a benchmark in the Brazilian capital market. So the managers were quite upset about this. And after 1 year, we 5 board members were fired from the fund. They did not, no longer wanted us on the board. And years later, the 5 companies that had been vetoed went through systemic crisis, either related to governance or environment or to social issues. And these were companies that had enormous losses because of these aspects. This is just to show you that this these issues have been around for a long time. And just to again emphasize that these issues have been around for a long time. In 1999, in the 3rd revision of the best practices code of the Brazilian Corporate Governance Institute, we included at that time as one of the concepts for corporate governance, one of the principles we included corporate accountability, which involves social, environmental, and governance issues as well. So all of this was included in this code many years ago. And I was together with Petrus. I was part of the 5 board members that Petrus just mentioned. Yes, we left the board of that fund. Yes, Luisa wasn't one of the board members, was fired from that specific board of that fund that I mentioned previously. The concept of the 3 people, profit, and planning, has been around for 25 years. Exactly. Maybe it's been around for even more than 25 years. You're absolutely right. So it took some time for these concepts, these principles to mature.